Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics.
Exploring timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today.
Right back at ya.
We are diving back into Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God.
It's rich stuff.
It really is.
Last time we started unpacking Chapter 7 on God's omnipresence,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just so much more to uncover.
There is.
I mean, this is a big concept.
It's amazing how Charnock takes this concept that could feel, well, abstract,
Right.
and makes it so intensely practical.
Yeah.
He doesn't just lay out the logic.
Right.
He really digs into what God's being everywhere means for us.
Right, and he does it so masterfully.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we left off talking about this idea of God's supreme perfection, which he keeps coming back to.
Mm.
He's basically arguing that if we, as limited humans, see being present everywhere as a good thing, a powerful thing,
Right.
then for God, the source of all perfection, wouldn't that be even more true?
Absolutely.
it-
Charnock pushes us to think about perfection not just as this static state, but as something that's inherently tied to God's nature.
Yeah.
He gives the analogy of life being more perfect than non-life,
Right.
and reason being more perfect than just having senses.
Uh-huh.
So, building on that, wouldn't being everywhere be more perfect, more complete,
Right.
than being confined to one spot?
It's like saying a ruler who can govern their entire kingdom is more powerful than one who can only control a tiny village.
That's a good one.
Charnock even brings up how God imbued air and light with the ability to fill vast spaces.
Yes.
Almost like a little hint
Mhm.
of his own excellency in creation.
I love that detail. It suggests that even in the physical world,
Yeah.
God has woven in these echoes of his own immensity, and the
Oh.
things he made can spread so widely.
Right.
How much more so their creator?
And speaking of spreading out, Charnock gets into this whole debate about whether God can move from one place to another.
Yeah.
He almost seems amused at the very idea of trying to pin God down to a specific location.
Right? It's as if he's saying, really? We're going to try to box in the infinite.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how Charnock connects this to the bigger picture of God's immutability,
Uh-huh.
his unchangeableness.
Right.
Because if God moved in the way we understand it,
Yeah.
wouldn't that imply he wasn't fully present where he was before? Wouldn't that mean he changed?
And change, for God, would mean he's subject to time and space, which is exactly what he transcends.
It's a total head-scratcher if you try to think about it in human terms.
Yeah, it is.
Exactly.
Charnock is pushing us to break free of those limited categories.
Yeah.
He wants us to grasp the concept of a God who is present everywhere simultaneously,
Okay.
not flitting back and forth like we do.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Charnock links God's omnipotence, his unlimited power, with his omnipresence.
Right.
He boldly states, where God has power to act, he must also be present.
And that's a key insight.
It forces us to ask, could God, who was already immense before creating anything, somehow become less immense after making the world?
Right.
It's like saying an artist becomes smaller after painting a picture.
Doesn't make sense, right?
Not at all.
It's almost like Charnock is taking us on this cosmic tour,
Yeah.
using the vastness of the universe as a testament to the even greater vastness of God.
He's saying, look, if God can create countless
Yeah.
worlds,
Right.
wouldn't it stand to reason that he has to be present in all of them,
Yeah.
to sustain them, to work in them?
Mm-hmm.
He's using creation itself as an argument for his omnipresence.
Okay, so this brings us to a question that some people might have.
Okay.
What about those passages in Scripture that talk about God dwelling in heaven
Yes.
or in the temple?
Mm-hmm.
If he's everywhere,
Right.
how can he have specific dwelling places?
This is where Charnock makes a crucial distinction.
Okay.
He talks about God's essential presence versus his special manifestations. So while God may choose to manifest himself more gloriously in certain places, like heaven,
Right.
that doesn't mean he's absent from everywhere else.
It's like saying the sun can shine more brightly in certain spots,
Perfect.
but it's still present throughout the entire sky.
Yes.
It's just that its rays are more concentrated in some areas than others.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Charnock even uses the example of our soul being present throughout our body,
Mm-hmm.
but having different functions in different parts.
Mm-hmm.
It's in our fingertip and in our heart, but it does different things in each.
So just like our soul is wholly present but operates differently,
Yes.
God can be fully present everywhere,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but choose to reveal himself
Yeah.
in varying degrees and ways.
Yes.
It's subtle,
It is.
but it's profound.
It is.
It means we can't box God in with our limited human understanding of place.
Right.
Yeah.
His immensity can't be bound by those categories.
No.
Now, there's another potential head-scratcher that Charnock tackles. What about when Scripture says God comes to or departs from people?
Right.
Doesn't that sound like movement? Like, he's limited.
It does seem contradictory at first glance. I'm eager to hear how he explains this.
Well, he's very clear on this point.
Okay.
Those phrases, he says, are talking about specific manifestations of God's presence, not his actual essence moving around.
That's
it's like
it.
withdrawing comfort or pouring out grace, not physically relocating.
Okay, so it's like saying a clouded sun hasn't actually left the sky.
Exactly.
We just can't see its rays directly. The sun is still there, but its light is obscured.
What Charnock wants us to understand is that God's essential presence is constant, unchanging.
Right.
But the way he chooses to reveal himself can vary based on his purposes and what's going on in our hearts.
You know, it makes me think about those times in my own life when I've felt distant from God.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't that he was actually gone, but rather that his comforting presence was veiled for a time, for reasons I may never fully understand.
That's a really insightful connection.
Yeah.
And it highlights how Charnock's exploration of God's omnipresence can offer us a deep sense of comfort, even when we're struggling with doubts or going through difficult times.
Speaking of doubts, Charnock actually addresses the argument that God being everywhere would somehow diminish his glory, especially given the filthiness of some parts of creation. Some people seem to think that if God is present in everything, then he must be somehow tainted by the less pleasant parts of creation.
It's like they're saying, well, if God is in that, then he can't be all that holy.
Right.
But Charnock brilliantly rebuts this idea.
Yeah.
He reminds us that God, as the creator, sees inherent goodness in all that he has made. His presence doesn't defile him any more than a musician's touch defiles a musical instrument.
That's such a beautiful analogy.
Isn't it?
It shows that God can interact with creation without being contaminated by it.
Right.
Just as a musician can make beautiful music from an instrument without becoming one with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even takes it further, using the analogy of light illuminating both pure and impure objects without being affected by either. It's like saying a ray of sunshine can fall on a flower and a pile of dirt without becoming either beautiful or dirty itself.
Yeah.
It simply illuminates what is already there.
So God's presence doesn't make him less because of where it is.
Exactly.
It's a beautiful way to illustrate the transcendence of his being. He's not limited or defined by the things he creates, but rather he encompasses and sustains them all.
Now, this idea of God being present in everything naturally raises a question that Charnock doesn't shy away from.
Okay.
Wouldn't that mean pantheism is true? Wouldn't that mean everything is God?
Right.
Like, if God is present in a rock, doesn't that make the rock divine?
It's a valid concern. I'm curious to hear how Charnock navigates this.
He's very careful to draw a clear distinction. While God is present in all things, that doesn't mean all things are God. Creatures retain their distinct nature and are definitely not to be worshipped.
So it's like saying a king's presence doesn't elevate his guards to his level.
Precisely.
Even though they're standing right there with him. They are still distinct from him in their nature and their role.
Charnock is defending the distinctness of creator and creation, while also acknowledging the all-encompassing presence of God.
Okay.
It's a delicate balance, but a crucial one to maintain if we're going to grasp the wonder of his omnipresence without falling into error.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another crucial point that Charnock makes.
Okay.
Even if we know in our heads that God is everywhere, we often don't truly believe it, at least not in a way that impacts our lives.
He's so right about that.
Yeah.
He points out that many of our human failings, our struggles, even our sins, stem from this forgetfulness. It's like we try to convince ourselves that God isn't really there, watching and knowing everything we do, think, and feel.
Almost like that child's game of peekaboo.
Exactly.
We cover our eyes and pretend the other person has disappeared.
Yeah.
Even though we know it's not true.
And Charnock uses the example of Adam hiding from God after the fall, as described in Genesis chapter 3, verse 10. Even though Adam could hear God's voice, he still tried to physically hide, as if that were possible.
It's like saying, well, I wouldn't steal if the store manager was watching, but God, he won't mind.
It's a dangerous and delusional way of thinking, and
Yeah.
Charnock doesn't hold back in calling it out.
No, he doesn't.
He sees this disregard for God's presence as a form of idolatry, where we elevate our own desires and opinions above the authority of the Creator.
So we might acknowledge God's power, but try to forget his holiness, or we might celebrate his mercy while overlooking his justice.
Right.
It's like we're trying to create our own version of God.
Yeah.
One that fits our narrative and doesn't challenge our choices.
Exactly. We pick and choose the attributes that suit us in the moment, rather than facing the full reality of who God is.
Right.
And this selective belief, as Charnock points out,
Yeah.
is often rooted in a failure to grasp God's omnipresence.
It's like we try to relegate God to some far-off corner of the universe where he won't interfere with our plans or judge our actions. But as Charnock reminds us, God is not confined to a distant heaven.
No.
He's intimately present in every aspect of our lives,
Right.
whether we acknowledge him or not.
And it's not just that we forget.
Right.
He also says we often contemn God's omnipresence, which means we treat it with disdain or disrespect.
Yeah.
We actively choose to disregard his presence, behaving as if he's not there to see or judge our actions.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is.
It means we can't hide from God, even in the darkest corners of our hearts.
That's right. But Charnock doesn't just leave us with a sense of condemnation.
Right.
He also offers words of comfort and encouragement, especially for those who are struggling with temptation, affliction, or doubt.
So how can the omnipresence of God be a comfort?
Whoa!
It seems like it would have the opposite effect, making us feel exposed and vulnerable.
Charnock reminds us that God's presence isn't just about judgment. It's also about protection, provision, and guidance. He uses the example of a king's favorite being attacked while the king himself watches from behind a curtain.
Even though the favorite is being assaulted, there's a sense of security in knowing that the king is present and observing everything that's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Charnock points out that God's presence is even more intimate and powerful than that of an earthly king. He is not a distant observer,
Right.
but an active participant in our lives,
Yeah.
working all things together for our good, even when we can't see or understand his purposes.
So even when we're going through trials or facing fierce temptations, we can take comfort in knowing that God is right there with us.
Yes.
Not just watching, but actively working on our behalf.
That's right.
Yeah.
Charnock reminds us that God's presence is a source of strength in times of weakness, a shield against the fiery darts of the enemy, and a constant companion on the journey of faith.
That's a beautiful and reassuring truth. But how does this comfort apply to our daily lives, especially when we're facing real-world challenges like job loss, illness, or broken relationships?
Charnock emphasizes that God's presence isn't limited by physical location.
Right.
He's not just present in church buildings or during times of prayer. He's present with us in our workplaces, our homes,
Right.
and even in the darkest valleys of suffering.
Okay.
He uses the example of the sun,
Yeah.
which shines on both the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly.
So even if our circumstances are messy or painful, God's presence is still there, shining light into the darkness and offering hope amidst despair.
Exactly. And he even extends this comfort to those who might be feeling physically isolated or alone.
Right.
He reminds us that no matter where we go, we can never escape God's presence. Even if we were to travel to the farthest corners of the earth,
Right.
we would still be within his reach.
That's a powerful reminder for those who might be facing loneliness, exile, or separation from loved ones. God's presence transcends all physical boundaries and offers a sense of belonging and connection that no human relationship can provide.
And it's particularly comforting for those who might be going through spiritual dryness or doubt.
Right.
Charnock points out that even when we don't feel God's presence, his essential being is still with us, unchanging and unwavering.
So even when our emotions are screaming, God, where are you? We can hold on to the truth that he hasn't left us. His presence may be veiled for a season, but it's never truly absent.
That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Our feelings can be fickle and unreliable,
Right.
but God's presence is rooted in his unchanging nature. It's a truth we can cling to, even when our hearts are filled with doubt or despair.
This brings us to another area of comfort that Charnock highlights, God's presence in our times of worship and service.
Yes.
He stresses that God is present not only to observe, but also to accept our petitions and answer our prayers.
He draws a parallel between God's presence in the temple in the Old Testament and his presence in the hearts of believers in the New Testament. He used the imagery of God dwelling in the contrite heart, a heart that's broken over sin and longing for his forgiveness and restoration.
So it's not about being physically present in a certain building or following a set of rituals. It's about approaching God with a humble and repentant heart, recognizing that he is present with us wherever we are, ready to hear and answer our prayers.
And he doesn't just focus on individual prayer.
Right.
He also highlights God's presence in corporate worship, emphasizing that the gathering of believers is a special place where God chooses to manifest his glory and power.
He uses the imagery of God walking among the golden candlesticks, a reference to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, symbolizing the church as a whole.
Yes.
It suggests that God is actively involved in the life of his people, guiding, protecting, and empowering them for his purposes.
And this presence isn't just passive. He's not just there in the room with us. He's actively engaging with us, speaking to our hearts, challenging us to grow in holiness, and equipping us to serve him in the world.
So when we gather with other believers for worship, we can be confident that God is present, not just as an observer, but as an active participant,
pouring out his grace, strengthening our faith, and uniting us as his body.
And this brings us to one of the most encouraging aspects of God's omnipresence. It's not just his essential being that's with us, but also the fullness of his attributes.
So we're not just talking about God's presence in a vague, abstract sense. We're talking about the presence of his love, his power, his wisdom, his mercy, his justice. All the perfections of his character are fully present with us wherever we go.
That's a powerful and comforting thought.
It is.
It means that no matter what challenges we face, no matter what temptations we encounter, no matter what doubts assail us, we have access to the infinite resources of God himself.
So if we need wisdom, God's wisdom is right there with us. If we need strength, God's strength is available to us. If we need comfort, God's comfort is ours for the asking.
Exactly. And this brings us to Charnock's practical exhortation. He doesn't want us to simply acknowledge this truth intellectually. He wants us to live it out, to let the reality of God's omnipresence transform our thoughts, words, and actions.
So what are some specific ways we can cultivate a greater awareness of God's presence in our daily lives? How can we move from intellectual assent to lived experience?
He urges us to be intentional about meditating on this truth. To really grapple with what it means for God to be present with us at all times and in all places.
So it's not just about adding a quick "God is here" to our mental to-do list. It's about taking time to ponder the implications of this truth, to let it sink deep into our hearts and minds.
He also challenges us to resist the temptation to compartmentalize our faith, to relegate God to certain times or places. Instead, he encourages us to cultivate a constant awareness of his presence, whether we're at work, at home, or out in the world.
It's like developing a spiritual muscle, a habit of recognizing God's presence in every moment. No matter how mundane or extraordinary.
He even suggests specific practices, like pausing before engaging in any activity to acknowledge God's presence, and seeking his guidance in every decision we make.
It's about cultivating a posture of dependence, recognizing that we're not alone in navigating the complexities of life. We have a constant companion, a wise counselor, and an all-powerful helper in God himself.
And this awareness, Charnock argues, will have a profound impact on our lives. He highlights 3 specific benefits of living in the light of God's omnipresence.
I'm eager to hear what those are. It seems like such a simple truth. Yet it has the potential to revolutionize our entire outlook on life.
First, he argues that a constant awareness of God's presence will serve as a shield against temptation.
So if we're tempted to lie, cheat, or engage in any other sin, remembering that God is present will make us think twice before giving. It's like having a built-in accountability partner, always there to remind us of the consequences of our choices.
He uses the example of Moses, who resisted the temptations of Pharaoh's court because he kept his eyes fixed on the invisible God. It was the awareness of God's presence that gave him the strength to stand firm in the face of allurements and threats.
It makes me think about that verse in Psalms chapter 16, verse 8.
Yes.
I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken.
That's a beautiful illustration.
Yeah.
When we keep God's presence at the forefront of our minds, it's like having an anchor for our souls, keeping us steady amidst the storms of temptation.
It's not that the temptations disappear, but rather that our perspective shifts. We see them in light of God's holiness and our own accountability to him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the second benefit that Charnock highlights, a heightened motivation for holy living. He argues that when we truly grasp God's omnipresence, it will spur us on to live lives that are pleasing to him.
It's like that old adage, dance as if no one is watching, but live as if God is always watching.
He uses the example of David, who in Psalms chapter 119, verse 168, declares, I keep your precepts and your testimonies, for all my ways are before you. It was the awareness of God's constant presence that motivated David to pursue righteousness and obedience.
It's not about trying to earn God's favor through good works, but rather about responding to his love and grace with a heart that desires to honor him.
And this leads us to the third benefit.
Okay.
A greater sense of focus and reverence in our times of worship.
Right.
Charnock argues that when we truly believe God is present with us, it will transform the way we approach prayer, Bible study, and corporate worship.
It's about moving beyond empty rituals and rote recitations to engage with God from a place of genuine awe and wonder.
He uses the analogy of school children behaving differently when the teacher is present.
Yeah.
When the authority figure is there, they're more attentive, more respectful, and more eager to learn.
Right. So if we truly believe God is present with us during our times of worship, we'll approach him with a greater sense of reverence, humility, and attentiveness. We won't be as easily distracted or prone to wander in our thoughts.
He even encourages us to use the truth of God's omnipresence to combat distractions during prayer or Bible study. If a distracting thought enters our mind, we can gently push it aside by reminding ourselves, God is here with me right now, and he deserves my full attention.
It's like silencing our phones and turning off the TV so we can give our loved one our undivided attention.
Yeah.
We're essentially saying, God, you are more important than any distraction, and I choose to focus on you.
And Charnock goes beyond these specific benefits, reminding us that a deep understanding of God's omnipresence has the power to transform our entire perspective on life.
It's like putting on a new pair of glasses and suddenly seeing the world in a whole new light. Everything takes on a deeper meaning when we view it through the lens of God's constant presence.
He challenges us to view every encounter, every experience, every moment as an opportunity to commune with God, to learn from him, and to reflect his glory back into the world.
So even the most mundane tasks like washing dishes or folding laundry can become acts of worship when we do them with an awareness of God's presence. It's not about the task itself, but the heart behind it.
He also encourages us to see God's hand in the beauty of creation, to hear his voice in the whispers of our conscience, and to feel his love in the kindness of strangers. It's about cultivating a heart of gratitude, recognizing that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, who is constantly showering his blessings upon us.
And this awareness, as Charnock so eloquently argues, should lead to a deeper sense of humility and awe. When we truly grasp the immensity of God and the vastness of his presence, it shrinks our own self-importance and makes us acutely aware of our dependence on him.
It's like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and feeling a sense of overwhelming awe at the majesty and power of nature. It reminds us of how small and insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things.
But on the flip side of that, it's also incredibly comforting. It means that even in our weakness, we have access to the infinite power and love of God. We are never alone.
And that's what I find so compelling about Charnock's writing. He masterfully balances the weightiness of God's attributes with the comfort and assurance they offer.
Speaking of comfort, I think it's important to revisit the implications of God's omnipresence for those who might be going through difficult times. Knowing that God is with us in our suffering, not just observing it from a distance, is profoundly comforting.
Absolutely. Charnock reminds us that God's presence isn't something that fluctuates based on our circumstances or our feelings. He's not absent when we're struggling, in fact. He's often most present in those moments, offering us his strength and comfort in ways we might not even realize.
It's like that image of a refiner's fire. The heat is intense, But it's in that intense heat that impurities are burned away and precious metal is purified.
That's a powerful image, and it highlights the transformative nature of God's presence. He's not just with us in our suffering, he's actively working in and through it for our good and his glory.
So even though we might not always understand why we're going through certain trials, we can trust that God is using them to shape us, to refine us, and to draw us closer to him.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the implications of God's omnipresence for our relationships with others. If God is truly present in every person we encounter, then how we treat them becomes a reflection of how we treat God himself.
That's a challenging but incredibly important point. It raises the stakes of our interactions, calling us to a higher standard of love, compassion, and respect.
Charnock reminds us that we are all created in the image of God, regardless of our background, beliefs, or behavior, and that inherent dignity should inform how we interact with everyone, even those who might be difficult to love.
It's easy to show love and kindness to those who are kind to us, but Charnock challenges us to extend that same grace to our enemies, just as Christ has extended grace to us.
And that's a radical notion, one that runs counter to our natural inclinations. But it's at the very heart of the gospel. We are called to love as Christ loved, to forgive as he forgave, and to break down walls of hostility with acts of kindness and compassion.
So it's not just about being nice, it's about reflecting the very heart of God in our interactions with others. And that, as Charnock points out, is a direct outworking of understanding and believing in God's omnipresence.
And as we wrap up our conversation on this profound attribute of God, this whole series here on Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics has been great.
It has.
I just want to reiterate that this truth has the power to radically change the way we live.
Right.
It's not just a theological concept.
Yeah.
It's a lived reality.
I love how you put that. It's easy to get lost in the intellectual arguments, but Charnock is always driving us back to the practical implications.
Yeah.
So knowing that God is truly present everywhere, how will that change how we act?
Exactly. He doesn't want us just nodding our heads in agreement.
Right.
He wants us to be transformed by this truth.
Right.
One of the first things he points out is that this awareness of God's presence should change how we view every encounter, every experience. It's like each moment becomes an opportunity to connect with God, to learn from him, to reflect his glory back into the world.
So even the most mundane tasks, like washing the dishes or folding laundry, can become acts of worship when we do them with an awareness of God's presence. It's not about the task itself, but the heart behind it.
He also encourages us to see God's hand in the beauty of creation, to hear his voice in the whispers of our conscience, and to feel his love in the kindness of strangers. It's about cultivating a heart of gratitude, recognizing that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, who is constantly showering his blessings upon us.
And this awareness, as Charnock so eloquently argues, should lead to a deeper sense of humility and awe. When we truly grasp the immensity of God and the vastness of his presence, it shrinks our own self-importance and makes us acutely aware of our dependence on him.
It's like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and feeling a sense of overwhelming awe at the majesty and power of nature. It reminds us of how small and insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things.
But on the flip side of that, it's also incredibly comforting.
It is.
It means that even in our weakness, we have access to the infinite power and love of God.
Yeah.
We are never alone.
And that's what I find so compelling about Charnock's writing. He masterfully balances the weightiness of God's attributes with the comfort and assurance they offer.
Speaking of comfort, I think it's important to revisit the implications of God's omnipresence for those who might be going through difficult times.
Yeah.
Knowing that God is with us in our suffering, not just observing it from a distance, is profoundly comforting.
Absolutely. Charnock reminds us that God's presence isn't something that fluctuates based on our circumstances or our feelings. He's not absent when we're struggling.
Yeah.
In fact, he's often most present in those moments,
Right.
offering us his strength and comfort in ways we might not even realize.
It's like that image of a refiner's fire. The heat is intense, but it's in that intense heat that impurities are burned away and precious metal is purified.
That's a powerful image. And it highlights the transformative nature of God's presence. He's not just with us in our suffering.
Right.
He's actively working in and through it for our good and his glory.
So even though we might not always understand why we're going through certain trials, we can trust that God is using them to shape us, to refine us,
Yes.
and to draw us closer to Him.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the implications of God's omnipresence for our relationships with others.
Okay.
If God is truly present in every person we encounter, then how we treat them becomes a reflection of how we treat God Himself.
That's a challenging but incredibly important point. It raises the stakes of our interactions, calling us to a higher standard of love, compassion, and respect.
Charnock reminds us that we are all created in the image of God, regardless of our background, beliefs, or behavior.
Right.
And that inherent dignity should inform how we interact with everyone, even those who might be difficult to love.
It's easy to show love and kindness to those who are kind to us. But Charnock challenges us to extend that same grace to our enemies, just as Christ has extended grace to us.
And that's a radical notion.
It is.
One that runs counter to our natural inclinations.
Yeah.
But it's at the very heart of the gospel. We are called to love as Christ loved.
Right.
To forgive as He forgave, and to break down walls of hostility with acts of kindness and compassion.
So it's not just about being nice. It's about reflecting the very heart of God in our interactions with others.
Yes.
And that, as Charnock points out, is a direct outworking of understanding and believing in God's omnipresence.
And as we wrap up our conversation on this profound attribute of God, I want to encourage our listeners to really grapple with what it means for them personally.
Right.
Take some time to reflect on what we've discussed today. How can you practically apply these truths to your life?
If you're joining us for the first time, we encourage you to go back and listen to the previous parts of this episode where we lay the foundation for this discussion. And be sure to check out other episodes in this series on the existence and attributes of God by Stephen Charnock.
Yes.
Here on Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics.
Exploring timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today.
We'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
We would.
You can connect with us on social media and share your reflections using the hashtag #TheDeepDive.
We are so glad you've joined us.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope that you will like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Until next time, may the awareness of God's constant presence fill you with peace, joy, and purpose.